In the dense, fog-choked hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where time itself seems to move with a reluctant, syrupy slowness, lie the skeletal remains of a forgotten dream. The Ashcroft Haven for the Weary Soul, as it was once known, is now little more than a collection of crumbling brick and rotted timber, its grand facade swallowed by kudzu and the relentless patience of the forest. For nearly a century, local lore painted its history with the broad, generous strokes of charity and salvation, a place of refuge founded by a visionary man of God. But history, as we know it, is often a carefully curated story, a narrative polished by the powerful until it gleams with a false light. In the spring of 2023, that light was finally extinguished. A state-funded highway expansion project required the clearing of a tract of land just behind the Old Haven property, a patch of earth-long, considered fallow ground. As the bulldozers bit into the soft, damp soil, they unearthed something that was not rock nor root, but bone. Then more bone. A state archaeological team was called in, and what they found sent a tremor through the quiet mountain communities. Not a recognized cemetery, not a Native American burial site, but a chaotic scattering of 143 shallow, unmarked graves, many containing the remains of more than one individual. Yet, the most chilling discovery was not the graves themselves, but a small tin box, sealed with wax and buried deeper than the rest. Inside, preserved from the ravages of time, were 2 leather-bound books, a meticulous, coded financial ledger, and the private diary of a man history had recorded as a healer. These documents, suppressed for decades and only now being deciphered, do not just add a new chapter to the story of the Ashcroft Haven. They tear the old one to shreds, revealing a conspiracy of greed and macabre cruelty so profound, so systematically evil, that it challenges our very understanding of the darkness that can fester behind a veil of piety. This is the story of the Ashcroft family, of the sanctuary they built, the souls they gathered, and the ghastly, unspeakable trade they perfected, a trade built on the coffins they sold with the dead still inside. The tale you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. It is a descent into one of the most hidden and disturbing chapters of American history. We are a community of truth seekers on this channel, brave souls willing to look into the abyss when others turn away. If you are one of us, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because you will not want to miss a moment of this investigation. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we begin to unravel the gilded lie of the Ashcroft Haven. To understand the monstrosity that the Ashcroft Haven would become, one must first understand the world that gave it birth and the man who presented himself as its savior. The late 19th century in the Appalachian heartland was a time of profound hardship, a landscape scarred by the recent memory of the Civil War and plagued by poverty that was as stubborn and unyielding as the rocky soil itself. Disease, famine, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness clung to the people like the perpetual mist in the hollows. Into this desperate world stepped Reverend Elias Ashcroft. He arrived in the small, struggling town of Providence, fall not as a native son, but as a figure seemingly carved from a different, more refined reality. He was tall and imposing, with a voice that could command a room with a thunderous sermon or soothe a grieving widow with a whispered prayer. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, seemed to hold both divine fire and profound empathy. He spoke of a new covenant, not just with God, but with humanity. He preached that it was the sacred duty of the fortunate to lift up the fallen, to provide shelter for the houseless, and to offer dignity to the forgotten. His charisma was magnetic, his sermons standing-room only events that drew people for miles around. They were tired of fire and brimstone. Elias offered them a vision of a heaven on earth. He did not merely preach, he acted. With funds from mysterious, unnamed benefactors in the north, he purchased a vast, isolated parcel of land nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by ancient oaks and shielded from the prying eyes of the main road. There, he announced his grand project, the Ashcroft Haven for the Weary Soul. It was to be more than a poorhouse. It was to be a sanctuary. It would have a modern infirmary for the sick, clean dormitories for the indigent, fertile fields for growing food, and a chapel whose steeple would be the highest point in the county, a constant reminder of God's grace. The people of Providence Fall and the surrounding areas saw him as a living saint. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of progress and piety who was single-handedly dragging their community into a more compassionate future. In an era of rampant exploitation by coal barons and railroad tycoons, Reverend Ashcroft seemed to be the antithesis, a man who gave everything and asked for nothing but faith in return. His words, recorded in the Providence Fall Chronicle, captured the essence of his appeal. We are all of us but weary travelers on a difficult road. It is our charge, our divine imperative, to build oases in the desert of despair, to offer a cool drink of water to those whose throats are parched by hardship, and to remind them that they are not, and never will be, forgotten by their God or by their fellow man. These were beautiful, powerful words. But behind the eloquence, behind the beatific smile and the seemingly selfless ambition, a different kind of structure was being built, one whose true foundations were not stone and mortar, but a cold, calculating, and utterly predatory vision of human suffering. A man like Reverend Elias Ashcroft, for all his charisma, could not erect his empire alone. The Ashcroft Haven was, from its inception, a family enterprise, a trinity of power that presented a perfect, unassailable front to the outside world. Each member of the family played a crucial, symbiotic role, their individual talents intertwining to create an operation of terrifying efficiency. If Elias was the voice and the soul of the Haven, his younger brother, Dr. Silas Ashcroft, was its clinical, methodical mind. Silas was the antithesis of his brother in demeanor. Where Elias was warm and expansive, Silas was cool, reserved, and intensely private. He was a man of science, a physician trained at a prestigious northern university, whose knowledge of medicine seemed almost miraculous to the rural populace. He rarely spoke outside of medical consultations, and when he did, his language was precise, detached, and devoid of the emotional flourishes his brother so favored. He oversaw the Haven's state-of-the-art infirmary, a building that was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. People who entered on the brink of death from consumption, typhoid, or influenza seemed to recover at an astonishing rate. Official reports, penned by Silas himself and co-signed by Elias, boasted a success rate that defied all contemporary medical standards. He was seen as a miracle worker, a quiet genius content to live in his brother's shadow while performing the practical work of healing. His public-facing persona was that of the dedicated, tireless healer, a man who had sacrificed a lucrative city career to serve the poor. But those who looked closely, or who were unfortunate enough to be his patients, might have noticed the cold, appraising quality of his gaze, a look that was less about empathy and more about assessment, like a biologist studying a specimen. The third pillar of this corrupt dynasty was Rebecca Ashcroft, Elias's eldest daughter. While her father charmed the public and her uncle healed the sick, Rebecca ran the machine. Possessing a mind for logistics and finance that was as sharp as her father's tongue, she was the practical enforcer, the manager who ensured the Haven operated with the seamless precision of a well-oiled clock. She managed the staff, the procurement of supplies, the meticulous bookkeeping, and the security of the sprawling compound. It was Rebecca who would politely but firmly turn away unwelcome visitors. It was Rebecca whose signature appeared on the supply orders and the financial reports. She was severe and humorless, a stark contrast to her father's public warmth, a fact that was often dismissed as the sign of a serious, dedicated woman burdened by immense responsibility. Together, the three Ashcrofts formed a perfect, self-contained unit. Elias was the charismatic leader, drawing in the vulnerable and securing the goodwill of the powerful. Silas was the methodical specialist, providing the technical expertise required for their hidden work. And Rebecca was the practical manager, ensuring the entire enterprise remained profitable, secure, and shielded from outside scrutiny. The Haven itself, with its high stone walls, its single guarded entrance, and its founder's obsessive privacy, began to look less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress, a self-contained kingdom ruled by a family whose virtue was as unimpeachable as their power was absolute. For the first several years of its operation, the Ashcroft Haven for the weary soul existed in the public consciousness as a flawless monument to Christian charity. The stories that emanated from behind its tall, imposing walls were exclusively tales of miraculous recovery and quiet dignity afforded to the region's most destitute souls. The local newspaper, the Providence Fall Chronicle, was filled with glowing editorials praising Reverend Ashcroft's vision and his family's tireless dedication. But even the most carefully constructed facade will eventually develop cracks, and the first fissure in the Ashcroft's perfect image appeared not with a thunderous exposé, but with the quiet, stubborn grief of a single, determined man. Jacob Miller was a subsistence farmer from a neighboring county, a man whose life had been defined by hardship. His only living relative was his elderly uncle Elias Miller, a man broken by a lifetime of labor in the coal mines, his lungs filled with black dust. With no family left to care for him and his health failing, Elias had been gratefully admitted to the Ashcroft Haven, an act for which Jacob was profoundly thankful. For the first few months, Jacob received neatly penned letters from his uncle, describing the clean sheets, the regular meals, and the kindness of the staff. Then, the letters stopped. Worried, Jacob made the day-long journey to Providence Fall to visit. Upon his arrival at the Haven's formidable iron gate, he was met not by the welcoming reverend, but by the severe, unsmiling figure of Rebecca Ashcroft. She informed him that visiting hours were restricted to protect the fragile health of the residents. He was told to return in a week. When he did, he was given another excuse. A minor quarantine was in effect. When he returned a third time, growing more agitated and suspicious, Rebecca met him with a look of practiced sympathy. She informed him that his uncle Elias Miller had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 nights prior. His consumption, she explained, had taken a sudden, aggressive turn. She assured Jacob that his uncle had been given the finest care and, in accordance with the Haven's policy for indigent residents, had received a dignified Christian burial in the institution's private cemetery, free of charge. Jacob was heartbroken, but also deeply unsettled. He asked to see his uncle's grave. Rebecca regretfully informed him that the cemetery was on consecrated ground, accessible only to the Haven staff and clergy, to maintain its sanctity. He asked for his uncle's belongings, a worn Bible and a few family photographs. Rebecca promised they would be sent, but they never arrived. Jacob Miller left the Haven that day with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Nothing about the encounter felt right. The bureaucratic stonewalling, the clinical, almost rehearsed delivery of the news of his uncle's death, the refusal to allow him a final moment of closure at a gravesite, it all felt wrong. He spoke to the local sheriff, a man who owed his position to a hefty donation from the Ashcroft family to his campaign. The sheriff listened patiently and then dismissed Jacob's concerns as the understandable but misplaced grief of a bereaved man. The Ashcrofts are Saint's son, the sheriff had told him, clapping him on the shoulder. Your uncle was in the best possible hands. Powerless and dismissed, Jacob Miller returned to his farm, but the seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time, someone had pulled at a thread in the Ashcrofts' carefully woven tapestry of benevolence. And though he did not know it, that single, frayed thread would one day lead to the unraveling of it all. The public face of the Ashcroft Haven was one of serene order and compassionate care. But to understand the terror that truly permeated its halls, we must step inside, past the locked gates and the watchful eyes of the staff. We must see the Haven not through the lens of a newspaper editorial, but through the frightened, observant eyes of a victim. Amelia Vance was 17 when she arrived at the Haven. Her family, tenant farmers from the next valley over, had been wiped out by the great influenza pandemic that swept through the country, leaving her orphaned and utterly alone. With nowhere else to go, the local parish pastor, a man who held Reverend Ashcroft in the highest esteem, arranged for her placement at the sanctuary. Initially, Amelia felt a profound sense of relief. The Haven was, as promised, impeccably clean. The routine was strict but predictable. The food was simple but plentiful. For a girl who had known only poverty and then sudden, catastrophic loss, this orderly world was a balm. But as weeks turned into months, her initial relief began to curdle into a low-grade, persistent unease. Amelia was assigned to work in the laundry, a steamy, loud building where she and a handful of other able-bodied female residents toiled for hours each day. It was here, in the hushed conversations over vats of boiling linens, that she first heard the whispers. She learned to recognize the signs of who would be called by the Lord next. It was rarely the oldest or the most overtly sick. Instead, it was often the quietest residents, the ones with no family, no visitors, no one to ask questions if they were to suddenly disappear. She noticed the patterns. A resident would be moved to Ward C, the so-called recovery ward at the far end of the infirmary, a wing run with obsessive secrecy by Dr. Silas Ashcroft himself. No one was allowed in Ward C except the doctor and two handpicked, silent orderlies. From the outside, it was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of coughing. No groans of pain, none of the typical noises of a hospital ward. It was as still as a tomb. Then came the sound. Almost every other night, long after the residents were locked in their dormitories, Amelia would hear it from her small window that overlooked the service road. The low, telltale rumble of a heavy wagon, its wheels muffled with cloth, moving away from the back of the infirmary and toward the far edge of the property. The wagon never returned until just before dawn, and it was always empty. The next morning, the staff would announce that another soul had passed peacefully in the night. Amelia's dread solidified when she began to pay closer attention to Dr. Silas. She watched him as he walked the grounds, his gaze never warm or compassionate, but always scanning, assessing. He looked at the residents not as patients to be healed, but as a farmer might look at livestock, evaluating their worth, their utility. His hands, so steady and precise during his rare public examinations, seemed to her not like the hands of a healer, but like those of a butcher. The atmosphere within the haven was one of quiet, suffocating control. Dissent was not tolerated. Residents who asked too many questions or complained about the treatment of others would be reprimanded by Rebecca Ashcroft. A second offense would earn them a visit to Dr. Silas's infirmary for nervous exhaustion, and they would often be transferred to the silent Ward C, never to be seen in the general population again. The fear was palpable, a silent covenant among the residents. Stay quiet, be invisible, and pray you are not noticed by the cold, appraising eyes of the good doctor. Amelia knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not a place of healing. It was a place of processing, a place where people entered, but from which they did not leave, their departures marked only by a brief, solemn announcement and the nightly, clandestine rumble of the muffled wagon. Every great fortune, it is said, is founded upon a crime. The Ashcroft family's wealth, which grew at a pace that far outstripped any plausible explanation of charitable donations, was no exception. To the public, their financial success was presented as a testament to their shrewd management and divine favor. The reality, however, was rooted in a second, far more lucrative enterprise, one that operated in perfect, ghoulish synergy with the haven itself: the Ashcroft and Sons Funerary Services. Located in the town of Providence Fall, miles from the isolated haven, the funerary parlor was a model of solemn, respectable business. It was managed on paper by a distant cousin, but the profits flowed directly into the family's coffers, a fact meticulously obscured in Rebecca's ledgers. While the haven served the poor, Ashcroft and Sons catered to the region's burgeoning middle and upper classes. They offered the finest services for a grieving family: expert embalming, tasteful viewings, and most importantly, the highest quality coffins available. Their caskets were magnificent creations of polished oak and cedar, lined with fine silk and fitted with gleaming brass hardware. They were symbols of status, the final, dignified statement for a prominent family. Reverend Elias would often officiate these funerals himself, his powerful voice lending an air of profound gravitas to the proceedings, a service for which he never charged, framing it as his Christian duty. This act of perceived generosity only enhanced the family's saintly reputation and drove more business to their parlor. The town saw it as another example of the Ashcrofts' piety. They provided a free, dignified end for the poor at the haven and a premium, respectable end for the wealthy in town. It seemed a perfect, harmonious model of Christian capitalism. But an open loop remained, a question that no one in a position of authority ever thought to ask. Where did this vast fortune truly come from? Donations to the Haven were modest. The profits from the funerary parlor, while steady, could not account for the family's expanding land holdings, their investments in out-of-state banks, or the constant, expensive upgrades to the Haven's facilities. The economics simply did not make sense. The family operated with a level of financial opacity that was absolute. Rebecca Ashcroft's books were a masterwork of deception, with income streams coded and expenses inflated. The Haven was positioned as a non-profit, a sinkhole for charitable funds, while the funerary business was the engine, but the fuel for that engine was the darkest secret of all. The two businesses were two sides of the same coin, one feeding the other in a perfect, horrifying cycle. The Haven provided the raw materials, a steady, unaccountable supply of human bodies. The funerary parlor provided the mechanism for converting those bodies into immense profit. The people of Providence saw a family dedicated to ushering souls into the next life with dignity. They failed to see the cold, hard calculus beneath. The Ashcrofts were not in the business of salvation. They were in the business of death, and business was booming. The whispers among the Haven's residents about the nightly wagon runs were not just paranoid fantasies. They were observations of a supply chain, a ghoulish production line moving its product from the point of acquisition to the point of sale under the cover of darkness. The thin veneer of order at the Ashcroft Haven was held together by fear and secrecy, a fragile construct that could be shattered by a single, determined witness. That witness would be Amelia Vance. Her growing dread had sharpened her senses, turning her into a silent observer of the Haven's dark machinations. One moonless night, her fear finally drove her to an act of reckless courage. Unable to sleep, tormented by the rhythmic, muffled sound of the approaching wagon, she crept from her dormitory. Hugging the shadows, she made her way toward the back of the infirmary, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found a hiding place in a dense thicket of rhododendron bushes that offered a clear, terrifying view of the loading dock behind Ward C. The scene that unfolded before her was one of sterile, almost casual horror. Under the dim light of a single lantern, Dr. Silas Ashcroft and his two hulking orderlies wheeled out a long pine box. It was not one of the fine, polished caskets from the town's funerary parlor, but a simple, crude crate. They worked with a detached efficiency that spoke of long practice. One of the orderlies, a brutish man named Gideon, pried the lid open. Inside, on a thin layer of straw, lay the body of a man Amelia recognized, a quiet old German immigrant named Mr. Schmidt, who had been moved to Ward C only the day before for what the staff had called a respiratory ailment. As they prepared to lift the body into the waiting wagon, the unthinkable happened. Mr. Schmidt's chest hitched with a shallow, ragged breath. His eyelids fluttered. He was not dead. He was heavily sedated, perhaps, but undeniably alive. Amelia stifled scream, pressing her hand hard against her mouth. She watched, paralyzed by terror, as Dr. Silas merely glanced down at the still-living man, his expression one of mild annoyance, not shock. He produced a syringe from his medical bag and, without a word, injected its contents into Mr. Schmidt's neck. The old man's body went rigid, then slack. The flicker of life was extinguished with a chilling finality. Dr. Silas then turned to the orderlies and spoke in a low, clinical tone that carried on the still night air. His constitution was stronger than anticipated. Note it in the records. We must adjust the dosage for subjects of his size and age. This was not a mercy killing. This was an experiment, a failed one. Amelia knew then that she was not in a sanctuary. She was in a laboratory, and the residents were nothing more than test subjects. She also knew that if she were discovered, her fate would be the same. Pure, primal terror gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She fled, scrambling through the underbrush, tearing her clothes and skin on thorns. She ran from the Haven as if the devil himself were at her heels. She ran all night, guided by instinct and a desperate will to live. By morning, she stumbled into the next town, a disheveled, terrified specter. In a state of near collapse, she sought out the one person she prayed might listen, the one person not enmeshed in the local web of power, Deputy Sheriff Thomas Hale. Hale was a young man new to the area, an outsider who had already felt the cold shoulder of the established order. He listened to Amelia's frantic, disjointed story with the practiced skepticism of a lawman. But he could not dismiss the raw, unfeigned terror in her eyes, or the specificity of her horrifying account. Her testimony, which he would later record, was a plea for belief. He wasn't dead, she had sobbed, her body racked with tremors. I saw him breathe. The doctor, he looked at him like he was a spoiled piece of meat. Not a person. He just ended him. For them, we are not souls to be saved. We are things to be used up. Deputy Hale was faced with a terrible choice. Believe this hysterical, traumatized girl and risk his career by challenging the most powerful and beloved family in the county, or dismiss her and live with the possibility that he had turned his back on an unimaginable evil. The look in Amelia Vance's eyes made the choice for him. This channel is dedicated to uncovering truths like the one Amelia risked her life to tell. These stories are often suppressed and forgotten, and it's our mission to bring them into the light. If you believe this work is important, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you are subscribed. Your support is what allows us to continue this investigative work and ensure that the victims of these dark histories are not forgotten. Armed with Amelia Vance's terrifying testimony, Deputy Thomas Hale began what he knew would be the most dangerous and difficult investigation of his life. He was a lone agent of inquiry in a county that was, for all intents and purposes, the personal fiefdom of the Ashcroft family. His first official step was to request access to the Havens records, specifically the death certificate and burial records for one Elias Miller, the uncle of the farmer Jacob, whose story now resonated with Hale's own suspicions. He was met with a wall of polite, unyielding resistance. Rebecca Ashcroft herself received him in her immaculate office, her demeanor one of cool, condescending pity. She expressed her deep concern for the poor, traumatized girl, who had fled their care in a state of delusion. She produced a flawless death certificate for Elias Miller, signed by Dr. Silas Ashcroft and countersigned by the county coroner, a man who happened to be on the Havens board of directors. The cause of death was listed as advanced consumption. When Hale asked to see the burial site, he was given the same excuse Jacob Miller had received. The cemetery was sacred, private ground. Every official door he tried to open was slammed shut in his face. He approached the county sheriff, his direct superior, a portly, complacent man named Beauregard. The sheriff listened to Hale's summary of Amelia's account, then laughed. He advised Hale to drop the matter immediately. "You're new here, son," Sheriff Beauregard said, his tone avuncular but laced with menace. "You don't understand how things work. Reverend Ashcroft has done more for this county than any man alive. You start throwing mud at a saint like that, and you're going to find this town ain't so friendly anymore. Let it go." The message was clear. Hale's persistence was not just a professional inconvenience. It was a threat to the established order. The local judge, who played poker with Reverend Ashcroft every Thursday night, refused to hear his petition for a warrant. The mayor, whose re-election campaign had been funded almost entirely by an anonymous donation that everyone knew came from the Ashcrofts, publicly admonished Hale for harassing a benevolent institution. He was being systematically isolated and discredited. The Ashcrofts' power was not just in their wealth. It was woven into the very fabric of the community's leadership. They had cultivated a network of patronage and obligation that made them virtually untouchable. To investigate the Ashcrofts was to investigate the sheriff, the judge, the coroner, and the mayor. It was to challenge the entire power structure of Providence Fall. Hale realized he was not just fighting a corrupt family. He was fighting a corrupt system, a system that had been meticulously designed to protect its benefactors. He was warned off, subtly at first, then more directly. His landlord suddenly tried to evict him on a technicality. He was ostracized by his fellow deputies. He was fighting a shadow war against an enemy with eyes and ears everywhere. The experience was deeply unnerving, solidifying his belief that Amelia's story was true. Innocent people do not require such a formidable, systemic firewall to protect them. The stone wall he faced was not the action of a family hiding a minor indiscretion. It was the desperate, coordinated defense of an empire built on an unspeakable foundation. Hale knew that if he were to break through, he could not use the front door. He would have to find a way to dig under the walls. Thwarted by the official channels, and facing increasing pressure to abandon his inquiry, Deputy Thomas Hale was forced to take his investigation underground. He knew that the Ashcroft's fortress of power and influence was impenetrable from the outside, but he gambled that its internal records, its own meticulous accounting of its deeds, might hold a key. He began spending his nights at the county records office, a dusty, neglected archive managed by an elderly clerk who was indifferent to the town's politics. Working by lamplight, Hale embarked on the painstaking task of cross-referencing every death certificate issued by the Ashcroft Haven over the past decade with the town's official burial records and cemetery plots. The work was tedious, but it yielded the first concrete evidence of a discrepancy. Dozens of individuals recorded as deceased at the Haven had no corresponding burial plot in any public or church cemetery in the county. According to the official narrative, these individuals were all interred in the Haven's private cemetery, a place that remained frustratingly beyond his reach. It was a suspicious pattern, but it wasn't proof of a crime. The real breakthrough came not from a public document, but from a clandestine meeting. Jacob Miller, the farmer who had been turned away when trying to visit his uncle, had heard whispers of the deputy's quiet investigation. One evening he sought out Hale, his face etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. He told Hale about his uncle, but he also provided a new, crucial piece of information. His cousin worked for a freight company in a neighboring state and had often spoken of the strange shipping manifests from the Ashcroft and Sons funerary services. They were shipping an unusually high number of their premium, top-of-the-line coffins to mortuaries hundreds of miles away, in bustling cities where the Ashcroft name meant nothing. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. Hale's investigation had been focused on the dead, on the victims. He now realized he needed to follow the money. He shifted his focus to the Ashcroft's legitimate, public-facing business. He began to track the finances of the funerary parlor, a far more difficult task. He pieced together information from tax filings, shipping records he discreetly obtained from a sympathetic railway clerk, and sales reports from the casket manufacturer that supplied the Ashcrofts. The numbers told a story that was both astounding and grotesque. The number of high-end oak and cedar caskets the Ashcrofts purchased from their supplier and subsequently sold, according to their shipping manifests and rumored sales, was astronomically higher than the number of recorded deaths of wealthy individuals in the entire region. Furthermore, it vastly exceeded the number of coffins their parlor could have plausibly produced or stored. The discrepancy was not a matter of a few units. It was a surplus of hundreds of coffins over the years. Where were all these extra caskets coming from? The question hung in the air, a logical impossibility. They couldn't be making them on the side. The manufacturer's records were clear. They weren't just storing them. The profits were too high. Hale stared at his notes, at the two columns that refused to balance, the list of the dead from the Haven and the list of coffins sold. And then, in a moment of sickening clarity, he saw the connection. The two ledgers were not separate. They were linked. The Haven wasn't just a place where the poor died. It was the factory. It was the source of the product. The bodies of the indigent were the key to understanding the impossible surplus. The coffins weren't empty. The puzzle pieces lay scattered on Deputy Hale's desk. Amelia's eyewitness account of a murder, the stonewalling by the town's elite, the statistical anomaly of the Haven's dead, and the impossible surplus of high-end caskets sold by the funerary parlor. Working in secret with a trusted state-level investigator he had contacted, a man far removed from the Ashcroft sphere of influence, Hale finally assembled the pieces into a coherent and utterly monstrous picture. The first layer of the Ashcroft family's criminal enterprise was a scheme of such audacious, ghoulish frugality that it defied belief. It was the direct explanation for the video's title, the truth behind the rumor that they sold coffins with the dead still inside. The scheme was a gruesome cycle of use, reuse, and profit. When a resident of the Haven died, either from natural causes or, as Amelia had witnessed, with a helping hand from Dr. Silas, the process began. The deceased was not treated with the dignity Reverend Ashcroft so eloquently preached. They were a commodity. The body would be cleaned, dressed, and placed into one of the magnificent, expensive caskets, the oak or cedar models destined for the wealthy clientele of Ashcroft and Sons. A sham funeral would then be held in the Haven's private chapel. A few staff members and perhaps a resident or two would be forced to attend, creating the illusion of a proper, solemn farewell. This served to maintain the charade for any observers within the Haven's walls. But the coffin's journey was not over. Later that night, under the cover of absolute darkness, the nightly wagon would make its run. The body of the indigent victim, now having served its purpose as a temporary occupant, would be removed from the pristine casket. It was then unceremoniously dumped into one of the shallow, unmarked pits dug behind the main buildings, the place that would one day be discovered by bulldozers. The expensive coffin, now empty and virtually unused, was carefully cleaned, polished, and prepared for its real purpose. It was then transported to the Ashcroft and Sons funerary services in town. From there it would be sold to a grieving, wealthy family for a handsome price, its brief, sordid history a complete secret. The family who purchased it believed they were buying a new, beautiful, final resting place for their loved one. In reality, they were buying a recycled vessel, a prop used in a macabre play, its silk lining having already cradled the corpse of a forgotten soul. This was the engine of the Ashcrofts' fortune. They had eliminated the primary cost of their funerary business, the coffins themselves, by sourcing them from the Haven. Each death at the sanctuary generated a double benefit. It removed a useless mouth to feed, and it freed up a high-value asset for resale. The system was sickeningly brilliant in its efficiency. Reverend Elias provided the moral cover. Rebecca managed the fraudulent books that made the recycled coffins disappear and reappear as new inventory, and Dr. Silas ensured a steady supply of deceased to keep the production line moving. They were not merely grave robbers. They were something far more cynical. They had industrialized death, turning the bodies of the poor into a disposable component in the manufacturing of obscene profits. The horror was not just that they desecrated the dead. It was that they had built a machine that required a constant stream of death to function. A machine where the lives of the vulnerable were worth less than the polished wood and brass of the boxes they briefly occupied. The revelation of the coffin recycling scheme was horrifying enough to secure convictions. But as the state investigator delved deeper, he uncovered a truth that was infinitely more depraved. The key was the small wax-sealed tin box unearthed with the graves, for it contained the private diary of Dr. Silas Ashcroft. If the financial ledgers described the what of the family's crimes, Silas's diary meticulously, chillingly, detailed the how and the why, and it revealed a layer of evil that went far beyond mere greed. Reading Silas's journal was, according to the investigators' later report, like peering into the mind of a demon who believes himself a god. Written in a precise, elegant script, the diary was not the ranting of a madman, but the cold, detached logbook of a scientific monster. Silas Ashcroft was not just a murderer or a con artist. He was a sadist who viewed the vulnerable population of the Haven as his personal collection of laboratory specimens. He had used the sanctuary, his human menagerie as he called it, to conduct a series of grotesque and unsanctioned medical experiments. The diary was filled with clinical descriptions of his work. He tested and proven surgical techniques on patients with minor ailments, often resulting in their deaths, which he would then cover up with a false diagnosis. He exposed residents to diseases to study their progression, withholding treatment to observe the full, agonizing course of the illness. The entries were devoid of emotion or remorse, reading like a research paper. A passage describing the fate of a young woman with a broken leg read, Subject 14b. Female, approximate 19 years. Introduced a strain of gangrenous bacteria to the fracture site. Fascinating rate of tissue necrosis. Subject expired after 72 hours of intense febrile distress. Respiratory failure. A valuable data point for my study on septic shock. The infamous Ward C was not a recovery ward. It was his vivisection laboratory. It was soundproofed not to give patients quiet, but to muffle their screams. Here, he practiced his most horrific experiments on living subjects, often under sedation that was just light enough for him to observe their autonomic responses to pain. The nightly wagon runs were not just for disposing of bodies for the coffin scheme. They were also for removing the mutilated remains of his failed experiments. The coffin scheme, as ghastly as it was in some ways secondary. For Elias and Rebecca, it was about wealth. For Silas, the wealth was merely a means to an end. It funded his true passion, the unholy pursuit of knowledge at any human cost. The murders Amelia had witnessed were not just to facilitate the recycling of a coffin. Mr. Schmidt had been the subject of an experiment to determine the minimum dosage of a paralytic agent required to simulate death. The experiment had failed. The dosage was too low. His on-the-spot murder was simply Silas correcting his mistake and tidying his workspace. The diary revealed that Silas was the true, dark heart of the operation. While Elias preached of saving souls, Silas was dissecting them. While Rebecca counted their money, Silas catalogued his atrocities. He was a methodical specialist in his purest, most terrifying form, a man who had perverted the sacred trust of a physician into a license for torture and murder, all under the protective shield of his family's manufactured sainthood. The full picture was now complete. The Ashcroft Haven was a three-headed hydra of evil, a fraudulent charity, a ghoulish coffin recycling ring, and a secret human experimentation lab. It was a perfectly integrated system where the ambitions of the charismatic leader, the practical manager, and the sadistic scientist fed and protected one another, creating one of the most monstrous criminal enterprises in the nation's hidden history. With the undeniable evidence of the ledgers and Dr. Silas's diary in hand, the state police moved with swift and decisive force. The era of the Ashcrofts' untouchability was over. In the pre-dawn hours of a cold autumn morning, a convoy of vehicles stormed up the long, winding road to the Ashcroft Haven, their headlamps cutting through the thick mountain fog. The raid was a scene of surreal contrasts, the violent, sudden intrusion of the law into a place that had always projected an image of serene tranquility. The state troopers, armed and grim-faced, breached the iron gates and swarmed the compound. There was no resistance. The staff, so accustomed to the absolute authority of the Ashcrofts, were stunned into submission. Reverend Elias Ashcroft was found where he so often was, in the grand chapel, kneeling at the altar as if in prayer. When the officers entered, he rose slowly, his face a mask of wounded piety and theatrical disbelief. He did not raise his voice, but instead fixed the lead officer with his piercing blue eyes. "By what right?" he asked, his voice resonating in the empty hall. "Do you desecrate this house of God with weapons and accusations? This is a place of peace." His performance of sainthood continued until the very end, a final, defiant act of a master manipulator. Rebecca Ashcroft was apprehended in her office, the nerve center of the operation. She was not praying. She was frantically attempting to burn the very ledgers that would condemn them all. The acrid smell of smoke filled the room as troopers burst in, wrestling her away from the cast-iron stove where pages of incriminating evidence were already turning to ash. Unlike her father, she did not feign innocence. Her face was a snarl of cold, calculating rage, her only words a venomous curse directed at the men arresting her. The most chilling discovery, however, was in the infirmary. Following the directions gleaned from his diary, investigators found the hidden entrance to Dr. Silas Ashcroft's basement laboratory behind a false wall in a supply closet. The room they entered was a sterile, soundproof nightmare. It was immaculately clean, smelling of antiseptic and formaldehyde. Surgical instruments were neatly arranged on steel trays. Cages lined one wall, and in the center of the room, under a harsh electric light, stood Dr. Silas himself, wearing a blood-stained apron. He was not surprised. He simply turned, his expression one of weary resignation, as if he had always known this day would come. He offered no resistance, only a single cryptic statement to the arresting officer. The ignorant are always afraid of progress. The evidence seized that day was overwhelming and irrefutable. The partially burned ledgers, the surgical tools from the lab, the testimonies of the terrified residents who were finally free to speak, and above all, the cold, damning words of Silas's own diary. The reign of the Ashcroft family was over. The fortress of lies they had so carefully constructed over 2 decades had been breached, and its dark secrets were about to be exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The subsequent trial of the Ashcroft family was not merely a local affair. It became a statewide sensation, a macabre spectacle that held the public in a state of horrified fascination. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters to the small county courthouse, which buckled under the strain of the crowds. The trial was a collision of 2 realities: the public image of the Ashcrofts as saints and philanthropists, and the grotesque, almost unbelievable evidence of their crimes. The entire community of Providence Fall was forced into a painful reckoning. Families who had donated their meager savings to the Haven, who had listened to Reverend Elias's sermons with rapt attention, who had praised the family as pillars of the community, now had to confront the monstrous truth. The sense of betrayal was profound, curdling into a dark, collective shame. The prosecution, led by the state's top attorney, laid out its case with methodical precision. They presented the financial records, showing the clear, criminal link between the Haven and the funerary parlor. They detailed the impossible coffin surplus. They presented the forensic evidence from the 143 exhumed bodies, many showing signs of malpractice, malnutrition, and in some cases, clear evidence of surgical experimentation. But the most powerful moments of the trial came from the human testimony. A terrified but resolute Amelia Vance took the stand, and in a hushed, captivated courtroom, she recounted the night she witnessed the murder of Mr. Schmidt. Her testimony was clear, unwavering, and utterly devastating. She was followed by a parade of other former residents, each telling their own story of fear, intimidation, and the mysterious disappearances of their friends. The defense's strategy was to portray the Ashcrofts as victims of a conspiracy, and Amelia as a hysterical, vengeful liar. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of the prosecution's star exhibit, the diary of Dr. Silas Ashcroft. The prosecutor read passages from the diary aloud, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. The clinical, dispassionate descriptions of torture and murder, written in Silas's own hand, were irrefutable. They sealed the family's fate. Each of the Ashcrofts reacted differently to the proceedings. Reverend Elias maintained his air of divine persecution, often closing his eyes as if in prayer, a picture of martyred innocence. Rebecca was cold, defiant, and contemptuous, staring down the witnesses with undisguised hatred. Silas was perhaps the most unsettling of all. He showed no emotion whatsoever, listening to the descriptions of his own atrocities with a detached, scientific curiosity, as if observing a trial about someone else entirely. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was a formality: guilty on all counts. Reverend Elias Ashcroft, the charismatic leader, was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and over 100 counts of accessory to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Ashcroft, the practical manager, was convicted on the same charges, her role as the financial and logistical architect of the scheme laid bare. She, too, received a life sentence. And Dr. Silas Ashcroft, the methodical specialist, the dark heart of the enterprise, was found guilty of 143 counts of first-degree murder, in addition to countless other charges related to his experiments. He was sentenced to death. The fall of the House of Ashcroft was complete, a shocking and total collapse that left a permanent scar on the soul of the community they had so thoroughly deceived. The guilty verdicts brought the trial to a close, but they could not erase the deep wounds the Ashcroft family had inflicted upon the community and its victims. The aftermath was a long and painful process of cleanup, both literal and metaphorical. The Ashcroft Haven for the Weary Soul was shut down immediately, its remaining residents relocated to legitimate state-run facilities. The property itself became a place of profound shame, a monument to the region's collective trauma. No one wanted it. The buildings were boarded up, the gates were locked, and the grounds were left to the slow, inexorable reclamation of nature. The local government officially condemned the site, and for decades it stood as a dark, crumbling reminder of the evil it had hosted, a subject of ghost stories and whispered warnings passed down through generations. The most grim task was the exhumation and identification of the victims from the mass grave. It was a heartbreaking and largely fruitless endeavor. These were people who had been deliberately chosen for their anonymity, individuals without families or connections. Of the 143 sets of remains initially found, and the dozens more discovered in subsequent searches of the property, fewer than 20 were ever positively identified. The rest were reinterred in a new, consecrated community cemetery, their graves marked with simple stones that read, "Known only to God." They were the forgotten souls Elias Ashcroft had promised to save, only to be systematically erased, their stories and identities lost to the cold, calculating greed of their supposed saviors. Deputy Thomas Hale, the once ostracized lawman, became a hero, though he never saw himself as such. Haunted by the horrors he had uncovered, he resigned from his post shortly after the trial and moved away, seeking a quiet life far from the shadow of the haven. Amelia Vance, the brave woman whose testimony had been the key to unlocking the case, was given a small sum from the state's victim fund and disappeared into anonymity, hoping to leave the trauma of her past behind her. The legacy of the Ashcroft affair was a lasting stain of suspicion and distrust in the region. It served as a brutal, cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith and the seductive power of charisma. It demonstrated how easily a community, desperate for a savior, could be deceived, and how institutions designed to protect the vulnerable could be twisted into instruments of their exploitation. The story became a piece of dark folklore, a Gothic Americana tragedy that highlighted the deep-seated fears of the lonely and the dispossessed. It proved that the greatest monsters are not mythical beasts, but human beings who wear masks of virtue, and that the most terrifying horrors are not those that happen in fiction, but those that are meticulously planned and executed in secret, hidden in plain sight, just behind the walls of a place that calls itself a sanctuary. The name Ashcroft became a curse in those mountains, a byword for the ultimate betrayal of trust. We have now reached the end of this dark, unsettling history. The story of the Ashcroft family and their haven for the weary soul serves as a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity and the insidious nature of evil when it cloaks itself in the robes of righteousness. Today, the ruins of the haven are all that remain, a skeletal reminder being slowly crushed by the forest, its secrets having been dragged into the light. But as we reflect on this singular, horrifying case, we are inevitably left with a series of deeply troubling questions. How many other such havens existed in the dark corners of our history, preying on the voiceless and the vulnerable? How many other saints and visionaries, lauded by their communities, were secretly monsters, their good deeds a carefully constructed facade to hide unspeakable crimes? The Ashcroft family was caught, their machine of death dismantled. But their success for over 2 decades proves how terrifyingly easy it was to operate. They exploited a fundamental flaw in human nature, our desire to believe in good, and our reluctance to question those who project an aura of authority and piety. Their victims were chosen precisely because they were the people society had already thrown away. They were invisible in life, and the Ashcrofts banked on them remaining invisible in death. This story is a stark and vital reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must be willing to question authority, and that we have a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, for they are the canaries in the coal mine. Their suffering is often the first sign of a deeper, more systemic sickness. The darkness that resided in Elias, Silas, and Rebecca Ashcroft is not, unfortunately, unique to them. It is a potential that lies dormant in the human condition, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, power, and a lack of oversight to flourish. It is our duty as a society and as individuals to ensure that we never create the conditions that allow such horrors to take root and grow in the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey into the past. The stories we tell here are a vital part of remembering the forgotten and learning from the darkest chapters of our history. If you found this investigation meaningful, please help us continue our work. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to hit the bell icon so you never miss a new exploration into the shadows. Comment below with your thoughts on this story and share it with others who you think are brave enough to confront these truths. Your engagement is the lifeblood of this community. Until next time, stay vigilant and never stop questioning.